several years, I've been doing for the
Sorry.
last several years, I've been doing agile training and transformational work and whatnot. In fact, I did some work for David Steckleather, who's on the call here. Anyway, very recently, I have gratefully I've become one of the newest LeSS trainers in the globe. We had a new one show up just like a day or two ago. So I was 24. Now I'm a one of 25, and so that's great. And uh, as part of writing as part of becoming a LeSS trainer, you have to write a case study regarding work that you have done uh, as part of a LeSS-like transformation. And we have on the call, we'll give his pseudo name, which is the name used in the case study, is Mitya. And uh, very, for the sake of an anonymity of the client, trying not to say too much, but I will say this. So he was a key director at the time that was there. It was his group of people that were doing low-level BIOS code that we completely changed the structure under which that group was working, building what were effectively extended component teams. Um, and there wasn't much that we didn't do side by side on everything we did. And another thing that's on a personal level, um, when you find yourself on a plane every week, it can get lonely. You see your family on the weekends, and you're out on the road. And I was so grateful to have been more or less adopted by Mitya and his family. So I know him. I know his child knows me as Uncle James, and I know his wife, and I know some of his extended family. And I could not be more grateful for that opportunity to have gotten to know his family. And we now we're more close personal friends than we are work friends. Um, so anyway, hard hitting Silicon Valley. Uh, Mitya, do you have anything else to say that you think would be appropriate for you?
About myself.
Yeah, about your coolness,
Yeah.
your badassage, your badaudacity.
No, I appreciate James. A very nice introduction. Thank you. It's James and I met kind of almost randomly. He was hired by the client that he describes, not necessarily to help my team, but help other teams, and kind of slowly but surely we became friends later. First, probably just learning about me learning about the agile methodology he was putting in place. And then, as he described later, became friends. And because we've stolen him from hotel rooms many times into family occasions, and yeah, it's been a long professional and personal friendship as well. I'm very pleased to be able to contribute to your group and other groups that we've been part of in these discussions. It's fascinating to and very meaningful to contribute my experience and our experience.
And professionally, you've been hardware, firmware, BIOS engineer type.
Yeah, most of my career for about less than 20 years, 17 years in the low-level code, and then recently last couple of years, maybe 5 years, in more kind of operating system, and now in DevOps actually last year. So very far away from low-level firmware at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Mitya. Let me get us started here. Okay, so everybody can see my screen. You can see my messed up settings. What we're going to be walking through is this case study, which has been painfully edited by, I had the privilege of having Victor Gagarik as my assigned mentor, and he did a wonderful job. And then Boss Vode read it briefly and then threw it over the wall to Craig, who then continued to picked up the editorial pen again. And so a year and a half, two later, voila, finally the thing is done. It's like a thesis, and like every other thesis, nobody really reads these things, but it's here. And in fact, there are skimming notes that I strongly advise you make use of. And if you're really interested, drill down or read the whole thing. But it's like 70 pages, so it's a big one. Anyway, so we're going to go over this today. We're going to go over it as fast as we can because the really interesting thing is the questions. And the most interesting person to answer the questions is usually actually Mitchell. So I'll do just enough to kind of set the stage, and then we'll pass it off to Q&A as soon as I can. Is everyone, I set the link in, I put the link in chat so y'all can follow along. I'd put that in another browser if you would. That'd be helpful to you. Does everyone have that?
Yep.
You got it? Okay. Okay, here we go. So, overall context. And I'm going to see if I can go a little faster than we did last time we tried this. So, oh, by the way, there's this timeline. It's not a bad idea to even keep this timeline up in a separate tab when you're reading this thing. Okay, so let's talk about, I guess, this whole thing. Okay, from a holistic perspective, this is a product that is basically a server infrastructure on a forklift, on a pallet. So it has your network, it has your compute, it has your storage. Those can be configured in all kinds of different configurations. There are multiple companies that make this kind of thing. It's the sort of thing where your customer base is large investment banks and scientific computing, DOE labs and this kind of thing. And so similarly, your technical support people, I mean, they're as well paid as the engineers that are developing the product. And if you have a problem and you need something, they'll jump on a private plane if they have to, because, a trading system might be down or whatever. So, gold level plating of support if you want to pay that kind of money. Smaller deployment base, on-premise deploy. This is not a cloud solution. And so just like any other physical hardware that's deployed in the field, every time you do an upgrade, it's a big deal. And it's a bigger deal than it should be, but that's another topic. There is, at the top level, there's a high-level orchestration layer that is, if you will, a single pane of glass to help you understand what the system is doing as a whole. There are, this is a blade system, so there's a bunch of blades, and those blades are in a chassis. And then there's also storage with all some hard drives and this kind of stuff, running SAN drives, and it may just be RAID. Mitri could fix me on that, but it doesn't matter. Within each blade, it's basically its own motherboard, its own computer. There is a tiny little node controller which is always on, which is basically if you want to reboot the machine or you want to reboot the blade, this is the thing that's there to do the soft reboot, basically. It can power cycle and this kind of thing. And all this is plugged into a back plane. And if Mitri was talking, he would talk about you get great density and all these things, and I'm sure they're true. Probably not culturally important. Now, as you keep drilling down, you have the Intel chips, and these Intel chips come out, every time Intel is going to make a new chipset. And these are, server grade. These are not necessarily what's in your personal computer. Or they're not what's in your personal computer for a long time. That has its own custom BIOS, just like it would for multi-core, multi-chip, just like it would for anything else. There are NIC cards and read-only memory and all of that, and of course the chip has to talk to that. And then whenever the administrator code sends down a command, it has to go through multiple components to get down to the CPU layer. I'm sorry, to get down to the BIOS, to get down to the individual code. And the thing to take away here from a high-level perspective is the code that is up here in this MCS administrator and the MCS GUI. This is effectively middleware code. It happens to be written in C++, but they could have written it in Java. They could have written it in C#. Yes,
I'm listening to
I just muted James. Apologies.
Okay. So it's high-level code. It's effectively middleware. It's running on hardware that's stable, right? So this is not experimental. It may be, sold as a network device that slides into your rack, or comes in a rack that comes on a forklift, basically. But it's stable. You don't have to worry that the hardware is flaky. As you move down and you get closer and closer to the bare metal, and you get down to this blade, well, this blade is brand new hardware. The chips are, we don't even know if the bug is in the hardware or the bug is in the firmware. You are happy if you don't have to write assembly code. So very, very low level. It's not at all uncommon that people are spending time in a lab with logic analyzers and oscilloscopes and whatever they need to physically mess with stuff. And if they're testing and they need to know if it has a thermal problem, I remember one of the guys, one of the other directors would say, you pull out a hairdryer and you point a hairdryer at it and you see if it gets hot, or you point a heat gun of some sort at it. The flavor of software development runs the gamut from run-of-the-mill middleware at the top that just happens to be managing a complex server infrastructure that is itself very complex, to very low-level embedded code. Mitri, do you want to, without getting into too much details other than kind of setting the stage for the span of the type of flavors of stuff, anything else that you think would make sense to add?
Yeah, I think, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Yeah, good. I think you described it very well. The most important thing to keep in mind here is that there's, and this becomes clear why later in the study, there are many software components of very, very different domain knowledge and languages used, from Java to almost assembly, in this, the low level, the code that runs before operating system on an Intel CPU. It's not quite assembly, but it might as well be. It is C code for convenience.
Even the
but
standard C
there's
library is not there.
Right. So, and then as you go up into this box on the right, both kind of logically and physically boxes, the GUI certainly is HTML or Java, and it's very different software. Yet the functionality, as James described, this is kind of a nicely integrated system that forklifts into your data center. A lot of features that you may expose via GUI travel all the way through all the components to the BIOS, for example, to the firmware that runs on the Intel CPU. So I think that I would just add that picture.
Yeah, remember, if like old school on your own computer, if you're trying to like change your BIOS settings, you do out control, you do some key combination and it brings up that BIOS page. Well, remember, you have to be able to do that with this whole thing sitting, miles away, thousands of miles away. You have to be able to do that from here, and then it make its way all the way down to whichever blade it is that you want to mess with, right? So,
and I think, James, just to check, so there's a variety of hardware as well. So that's the software layers side of things. But am I correct in saying that there's a variety of hardware that this vendor deals with, and it's quite bespoke?
Mitya, hardware?
Yes, there is a hardware variety. There's going from the picture on the left side. There are components from other vendors. The components that this vendor doesn't produce. Intel CPU obviously, and memory and local storage on this motherboard. And sometimes network cards. Some of these vendors, this is not a unique vendor. Some of these vendors make network cards, and some of these vendors buy third party. There's definitely a lot of third parties hardware that's put together.
And some of that is like custom ASICs, right? The NIC is custom ASICs in many cases, or it depends.
It could be, yeah. It could be, yeah. And then I think as you go to the right, there is less and less custom hardware. And I think, as James mentioned, the GUI can run pretty much anywhere on any kind of VM or random random system.
But now when you sell to a system administrator, they don't want a software stack. They want a network device. So it may be sold as if it's a network device, even when that's a fiction. I mean, you know, it's like when you bought your Roku, but it's really a, not, yeah, get there. I didn't mean Roku, I meant TiVo, but that dates me. Okay, so moving on briefly, before I started working with Mitia, my sponsor here that was signing my checks, the equivalent to David Stackleather here on the call, but for this client, we were looking for something that was kind of isolated as a way to go show that indeed, if you structure your teams well, you will get vastly better results. And they had me look at other, you know, quote, agile efforts that were going on. But the reality is nothing was even close to the real thing. And so I decided, well, let's at least demonstrate what's possible in the real thing in a small bubble. And we had to find something that would make a bubble. And the thing that showed up the best was a diagnostic component. And what was interesting is it did cut through all the systems, because in order to be able to diagnose the product, it had to know a little bit and talk to the chip. It had the Intel chip. It had to talk to the NIC. It had to talk to the RAM. It ended up being a custom ISO boot that would boot up and then ran a bit of Python code that eventually then communicated up to the mothership later. This was indeed, in terms of a feature team adoption map, it was a nice vertical slice through the entire system. It really was a feature team in all things that includes. But it was just a single feature team. It was not multiple feature teams working off a combined product backlog. But no, that's in the case study. That kind of was foreshadowing for some other stuff. It was when I was helping this team that I had and I was, you know, sitting with them, and I trained them and I launched them. I sat with them and figured out definition of done and all these other things. And it was after this team was starting to get up and going that Mitri and I really got to know each other better. And he had interest in, so here's that diagnostics team, happy people in a happy room with their physical board and all of this. Wonderful experience. So again, this was a real feature team in that case, but let's keep going. Next figure, here we go. Okay, so Mitia thought this was cool stuff. So we talked about what we could do, and due to some organizational dynamics. Yes, sir, go ahead.
First, I thought this was complete nonsense at the beginning, but then after not so I was told that you don't do agile in BIOS, you know, plain and simple, right? And so, you know, here came the a coach that hired by the business unit implementing these methodologies. And so I kind of, you know, I stayed on the sidelines because, you know, it's not for us firmware engineers. And then, you know, one step after another, and I don't remember all the steps, but I do remember very clearly one meeting where James was describing to me the organizational changes, you know, the model, you know, the concrete changes, the concrete framework, and psychological and you know, kind of a happy work environment benefit that might come with it. And it became clear to me that, you know, if you just peel away all of the nomenclature and names, this was a framework around what I wanted to do more and what I was doing to begin with the team, and it would help a great deal in many challenges that I was facing.
Mitya, if I might come in
yes.
at that point, because I was kind of curious what the problem statement was, you know, the thing you actually felt you wanted to change. And I think James may have touched on it a wee bit. I just wanted to get clarity on that.
Yes, you know, I a number of things. You know, there's so the team was at that time between 20 and 25 people, and in that team there were a number of, so there were a couple of problems. One, there were silos in the team based on people's expertise. You know, BIOS is a very it's a very unique area, and within that unique area there are a lot of unique areas. You know, for example, if a person who is an expert in memory initialization and memory tuning and you know, running memory at full speed, providing maximum maximum performance, maximum frequency, and so on for the memory, that person stays in that area and is normally plenty busy. That person may not for sure wouldn't have any expertise or maybe even interest in implementing some kind of API where higher level software would manage BIOS or interact with BIOS. You know, some kind of API where BIOS, where settings are sent to the BIOS. Even for that, for example, for the memory component, you've seen, you probably interacted, all of you interacted with the BIOS through this. You know, you press a special key on a PC and you get into the BIOS and you can change settings. Well, you know, in a data center, that's quite inconvenient. And so even to change memory setting, for example, that the person who is an expert in memory would go and, you know, modify some field, implement a new field maybe in this awkward GUI that's in a PC BIOS. So I was very much interested in breaking those silos, but it's extremely difficult without I mean, certainly you can do it with force, but it's just not my style. And this framework offered that. And yeah, so that was, for example, one aspect.
Thank you.
This is an interesting facet of it, which is that, let me go back to the right diagram. What we really wanted to do was everything that's green here. Ideally, you would create a feature team that had the skills to touch everything, not just test everything. So when we relaunched, when we did this new structure, we did indeed have a team that during validation, they would check everything all the way up through the stack, but they really only knew how to modify just the BIOS code. And even within the BIOS teams, the original BIOS teams, they were even more specialized than that, just as Mitya just explained. So actually just getting them to be able to work more broadly within the world that is the BIOS code. And think of this like writing a kernel inside of an operating system. Even then, you know, there's this whole ecosystem there, even if you're not dealing with everything that's sitting on top of the operating system. So even within the operating system world, in this case, within the AMI BIOS code, there is a multitude of aspects. And the code that this client writes is a tiny fraction of the overall code base, because the overall code base for the BIOS, because that is gotten from a third-party vendor, and they only make modifications to it. They don't actually own the underlying. They sit on top of a platform. Just because you would never want to rewrite Linux, well, you would never want to rewrite your own BIOS from scratch if you could avoid it. You would just want to modify it. But we did not build. What we actually built would be technically called an extended component team. So we expanded the bound. Oh, let me talk about why. And the why is because of this chart right here. So when I was initially there, all that stuff up high in the GUI control layer, all that stuff that's basically just middleware. You know, it's C++, but it's high-level C++ on stable hardware and all of that. That had a VP who was at best passive-aggressive to the idea. So the thing that would be the most obvious, which would be up at the top of the stack to go after, that wasn't an option due to an organizational and structural impediment. And yet, Mitya, who's hanging out here, he had a hardware VP who said, hey, we've been working with you for a long time. Their relationship goes back long before this company. And he basically said, carte blanche, hey, Mitya, if you feel that's the right thing to do, better to pull the Band-Aid off fast than slow. And so he had that, Mitya was granted that authority to go do some pretty significant changes. And then we also had a friendly up in our, what's really quality control more than quality assurance, but QA by title. And she was on board. And so when we formed up the teams, we had, people from the QA group that were on the newly formed extended component teams that were in a less like structure. We had them, they trained with everybody else, and we launched with everybody else, and day to day, they were no different than any other team member, although their formal reporting chain was not fixed. And this, if you read through the entirety of the case study, you'll see how that came to shoot us in the foot in the long term. But if you're wondering, why didn't we just go even more vertically sliced than we would want to? And the reason is because we didn't have the buy-in we needed on the software side of the house. It's just ironic, the one that would be the most likely to be a good fit. And so we went from what you see here, which is, the guy who just wants, Tom, who just wants to tune memory, to a much broader boundary than we had before. So they're still doing subsystem verification. And we eventually got to this, a little bit broader, that green. We stretched ourselves over time, but we never got all the way up here like we would want to and like would be the natural thing to do. And there's layoffs that get discussed. And one of the things that happened is about 3 months into my tenure there, just about the time Mitty and I were getting stuff going, there was a change in that SVP layer, where here I had a guy who said, James, it's not important what you can do for me. The question is, what can I do for you? You tell me what you need and I will help you make it happen. That was the first meeting I ever had with a guy. It was wonderful. As soon as that person changed, I didn't have that. Yes, sir.
Sorry, can I throw a question at you? Just seems very relevant to where you are now that I'm seeing in the chat. It was Rowan asking if you could have a magic wand to expand the LeSS product definition to the whole device, or at least all the software. What would be the big win of the changes involved?
We would have stopped having handoffs between queues as we coordinated the work up the chain. So we would go implement, say, something that wanted to change a bit of let's say you added a new parameter in your BIOS code, and you want to be able to modify and view the value of that parameter, that new parameter, up in the GUI. Well, if you want to do that, down in the BIOS, even with the expanded component teams, you have to make the change there. Then you got to go bug the other team that does the node controller, which is not code that Mitya's people ever touched. Then you also might have to touch the BIOS controller. And finally, you got to go touch the C++ code up here. And all those handoffs are a killer to do what should be pretty simple. And so, it would have solved those problems, almost overnight. Does that help, Rowan?
It does, yeah. I was actually, when I wrote the question, thinking what would be the changes that would be necessary in order to expand the product definition to that degree? What would be the main kind of headline changes you would need to have happen?
So when we launched, we had hardware firmware guys as well as QC quality control guys. And we slowly rolled. So the direct answer is, I need some of these circles and triangle people to be people from other parts of the stack. right? Not just BIOS people, not just BIOS testers, not just BIOS engineers, and not they need to be, you know, people that know the GUI layer, that are C++ people, that are et cetera. And that isn't what we started with. Now they started cross-training like crazy because they were doing testing all the way up the chain, and we were eventually weaseling our way into that code because these other teams were being run in a waterfall fashion. And as they got under the gun, they became more and more willing to have us look at the code and maybe suggest changes or maybe even make changes. We didn't get quite get there, but we got their blessing to do so, which is if it was something simple, we were going to make the changes ourselves, and they were okay with it because they were under all the delivery pressure, and they would be happy to have anyone else do the work that wasn't them, even though their VP wouldn't have been happy about it. You know, by the time it filtered down with like 4,000 people, by the time you got down to the tech leads or the first level managers, they didn't care what the VP said as long as they just wanted to get that work done. And this was one less thing on their head if they got it done. There's a cleverness going on here. For better or for worse, every time a new chipset came out, they forked the code for the BIOS, completely forked. And they did copy, paste, reuse. And that'd been going on for years. You know, one of the things we fixed was that, and it wasn't me, it was like they suggested this, and I strongly encouraged it when they did, is to always make use of a pluggable layer from then on, right? If at all possible, put it in the pluggable layer. And if you look at the definition of done that's in here, you will see that it says, you know, stick the new functionality, or stick any functionality, any migrated functionality, put it in the pluggable layer so that we don't ever have to do this again, because we've been doing it for like, you know, 10, 20 times. Every time a new chipset comes out, we have to go copy paste to the new branch. But we were able to use that to our advantage. I do not recommend it whatsoever to fork every time, but we used it to our advantage, and we said, we'll let these other teams that don't report to Mitya, that are off in India, we'll let them continue to fix bugs in the production releases. And because that's been waterfall, there is just a mountain of bugs for them to fix. And while they're busy for 6 months, 9 months fixing bugs in stuff that's in production and is at customer, you know, is deployed to customer sites, because it's an on-premise deploy model, we will build out this new model. And so we actually used the revision, the hardware revision, as a sneaky little boundary to build our little bubble. If that makes sense. It's like saying we're only going to do it for the new iPhone and we're going to leave the old iPhone software alone. It's effectively what you're doing. And so that's relevant here because we slowly expanded the boundary. And by the time we finally started to roll in the teams in India, because they were ramping down on the work they were doing, the new norms that had developed in the new teams with the vastly improved quality standard that they were holding themselves to, started to create a lot of social tension, which is, we knew that it would. That's exactly what we wanted. And we were able to deal with it at that time, or we would have been able to deal with it. And Mitya and I were getting ready to do another trip to India, and kind of deal with the, you know, basically we had a guy in India who was, Mitya's parallel in India was another of these passive aggressives. So you see the red stop sign was a problem. And so what would have happened had all things gone well is we would have gone over there, we would have done shuttle diplomacy, we would have tried to have brought this person along, and we may have been successful. And if we were not successful, I have a feeling that this VP would have solved the problem for us, and voila, everybody would have reported to Mitya, and it would have gotten fixed like that, right? And we were setting up those dominoes to fall in our favor. But what happened is this new SVP came in towards the end, where Mitya was getting his air cover. he left and went to a startup that Mitya actually followed a little bit after I left. And they all reported into basically this passive aggressive type who really didn't want this, right? And a lot of this fell, and then there were massive layoffs. So we went from like 4,000 to 2,000 people in the division. So massive headcount. And that was a problem. I don't know that, it's probably better to just well, I'll skim what little there is worth skimming, and then we'll stop and just do Q&A. Where's my DOD? So when we did initial brainstorming, what is effectively initial product backlog refinement, we spent several days in a room flushing that out. And then over the course of several weeks, we eventually massaged what's effectively story mapping of a flavor.
And I just want to add, James, here that since we're here, this was the first and just massive improvement in the way the team operated. As you can see here, there's no silos, right? There's no memory guy working on his own stuff. There's no boot from hard drive engineer working on her code. It's all well, it's not flat, but it's all it's all broken down into pieces. And I think if it was a couple of days that we all got in a room and plastered the walls and the windows, actually also with the stickies. It was an enjoyable experience. It was difficult experience at time, but it also it completely reset the team in the way we started operating from then on. Again, everybody was in a room. It's not a simple experience. Everybody gets in a room and you ask them, okay, so tell me, let's put your component into stickies, and of course you get kind of you don't get the granular answer right away, and so it's an iterative process, but very creative, and again reset the team kind of outlook on what we are about to do quite quickly.
And so the steps, just from mechanics, were pretty straightforward. It was simply once Mitty and I got on the same page about what we wanted to do, Mitty and I sort of co-trained. I mean, I led the training, but Mitty was there with me at all times. We had to do 2 cohorts in the San Francisco area, just because we had like 60 people, or we had more than we could fit. So we had to do 2 cohorts in San Francisco, and then we did that in like a single week, I think. And the following week, I went up to Portland and I did another like 2-3 days, I think 2, of basic Scrum training for the folks that were going to constitute the Portland team, which included some quality assurance people that we had stolen from another group to do some politicking we did. And once we did that, then we did the launch, and we launched everybody, and they indeed, they self-selected what their team compositions would be. We kind of explained what was required, and they, formed into their own, they decided who should be on what team. We didn't tell them that. We just told them the constraints. Obviously, Portland ended up being its own team, because how can you be co-located? They really only had enough for one. And then we did flushed out the definition of done. We flushed out the initial product backlog. Here's our handy helper, who Mitty doesn't have his camera on for reasons, but she's around there. Here was their initial definition of done. Here is a prettier version of their definition of done, a sprint or 2 later.
By the way, that even simple,
yes,
simple things like this, if you just scroll up back to the definition of done, that it is. I'm not sure how to emphasize very well how important this was. Such a simple thing. Surely people know when they're done, but it's a. I don't know. I think it was surprising to me that everybody had a different definition. We're not going to go into details here, but some of this we even had to discuss, maybe argue, right? For example, this number 8, I remember. Should we include severity 3 defects, or is it only the kind of the most difficult one? So this was yet another one of those big stepping stones into operating the team the way I think everybody should want to operate the team.
Yeah. So thank you. That was great. Yeah, there's other stuff. By the way, the easiest way to, if you look at the skimming notes, what you basically do is you read the synopsis, you read the captions on every figure, and then you read the summary. We could talk through these, or I think we probably should just do Q&A.
I think Q&A, James, might be a good time.
Yeah.
See what's on people's minds. So just for everybody, if you can vote on questions as well. So if there are questions in the list there in Slido, and you vote on them, they'll go to the top and we'll feed from the top. Or by all means, just throw the question at the team. We're not a very large group anyway. So any questions there for the team? Anything unclear from what's been discussed? So we'll probably go for the top there. There's another one of Rowan's questions, James. I'm not. I'll read it anyway, just to make it a bit easier for yourself and Mattia. What have you learned about the importance of leadership alignment on the adoption, and what would you suggest others try to improve support from leaders?
So the first thing is, don't lose your supportive general manager of a 4,000 person division within the first 3 months of an engagement. That's the first one. The second one is, in retrospect, I think had I run the sort of Y-leaning organizational design workshop that is a certified LeSS practitioner or a certified LeSS for executives, and had I had the skill and the wisdom and knowledge to know how to do that well at the time, which this has been a few years. And I mentioned it takes a while to get through the case study. So it's not an easy process to get your wand. But in retrospect, had I been able to do that well, perhaps there would have been so much buy-in and, let's say, losing of faith, the risk of losing faith, the risk of leadership losing face by moving away from it. That even with the loss of the GM, that might not have happened, and maybe I would have even been able to protect the GM. The other thing that could have happened is that putting that up front could have spooked them, and it wouldn't have happened at all. So it could have shut it down fast. Now, what's interesting is you've touched on a kind of a bipolar position here between Craig and Boss to some extent. So Boss is kind of a slowly cook the frog. It's not as helpful to put everything in their face right away. Be careful just how much buy-in you get, because that can actually come back and bite you. He talks about that in his training. And then also, like, we talk about these things as we go through the case study and as we do interviews and this kind of thing. And on the flip side, Craig is very much of a, I'm going to lead you to water, and if you choose to drink, that's great. And if you don't, well, I've got other people to go help. And sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think both of them would tell you the same thing, right? They just happen to lean one way or the other. So I think maybe had I run what is effectively a certified LeSS for executives, not because it's called a CLE, but because it's really an organizational design workshop that focuses on these and does a bunch of system modeling, it might have helped and made a difference. But the biggest thing is not losing my GM on the first 3 months.
Nice one.
Any
Thank you.
follow-ups on that? That's a hell of a question.
No, thank you. That was really good. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, James. The next one I've got here is, why did you go for LeSS? Of all the frameworks, why LeSS?
Didn't actually do LeSS. I didn't know, I had not read the LeSS books at the time that I was helping Mitya. I simply did what I may have been somewhat aware of Nexus. I was simply doing what in my mind was the natural thing to do. One of the reasons that I love LeSS so much is it aligns perfectly with my own views. It also highlights the problems you'll have if you don't deal with some of the structural issues, which are exactly the problems that I had because we didn't deal with some of the structural issues. To the extent we changed structure, we had amazingly better outcomes. To the extent we did not change structure, to that same extent, we suffered for not doing so and suffered the challenges that came from that. So, yeah, I mean, I wrote a case study about what was effectively a LeSS-like adoption, which was actually, I think, about the time that LeSS had come out. I think it only came out like a year before I did this. So maybe it's not that bad that I didn't know it well. But actually, that's only the third book. The earlier books had. But that wasn't a LeSS as a framework at the time.
It's interesting, James. Sorry if I'm interrupting.
Sure, no, please do.
What you said, that so you didn't do LeSS. You just did something that naturally made sense, and that is exactly what I've heard. I've heard somebody, on a whiteboard describing something that naturally makes sense. So that may be also a key to adoption, of a framework. A person you're trying to adapt what you're proposing will hear if you're proposing something that is natural to you and will be natural to them.
Now, an interesting counterpoint to that is I was talking to Boss the other day, and Boss said, that's interesting because it wasn't natural to us at the time. And I think one of the big reasons for that is, they were dealing with a context at Nokia Networks where they needed the LeSS huge, right? And to be fair, I don't know that I would have known what to do were we dealing with more than half a dozen teams, right? Where we're dealing with all 4,000 people. I just knew enough to see through the fog to do what is effectively LeSS basics. Now I know a whole lot more, and I've had the benefit of a tremendous amount of conversations and deep thinking about this. Much of the credit goes to, some of it goes to David on the call, some of it goes to Victor Gagarik, who helped me edit my case study, was wonderful there. Some of it goes to Craig Larman. I mean, I have been Larmaned for, months on end, and it helps with your thinking. It helps clarify your thinking. I don't think it vastly changed it. It clarified it more than anything. There's probably cases where that it did change it. I don't know it. He changed me and didn't even know it, and I didn't even know it. Darn him. So I don't think that I would know how to do LeSS huge just organically, 5 years ago would I've just have like, oh, this feels right. No, I think I would have had to experiment through it just the way that Boss did. I had just seen enough that was right and enough that was wrong with a small number of teams working together that part was more obvious. So let me be quiet and answer any follow-up questions on that one.
Okay, nice one, James. Thanks. There's a nice chunky one coming through here. Why do you think there aren't more LeSS adoptions in the US?
Oh, because it challenges the hell out of the status quo. It works because it changes power dynamics. It is resisted and is seen as a threat because it changes power dynamics.
Nice sharp answer there.
You want the snarky answer? Look at Larman's laws. Larman's laws of organizational behavior. They're snarky, but they're also true.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps not helpful, but true.
So I just want to maybe give an opportunity to the rest of the people. I don't see many questions in there, but maybe to anyone else on the call, any other questions for James and Mitya while we have them? Feel free to just call out if you want, otherwise I'll just keep going from the chat. So James, another one there. What motivated you to be part of this project in the first place, yourself and Mitya?
So for me, it's a privilege to help, free people from the tyranny of waterfall, basically. It makes people's lives better when this is done well. But Mitya will give a more specific answer to why he thought he wanted this. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, I think not. I'll mostly repeat what I said before, that it was a contrast to me when talking to James, when he was presenting what he was proposing, what he was, or describing what he changes in teams and how he approaches things, and what are the sort of giving me a small quick overview of the framework and the process. The contrast between me walking into the meeting and quote unquote knowing that it's not done in firmware, and then seeing what he's describing and how it fits with how I believe teams should operate, and both highlighting the challenges I've had in implementing change, and also highlighting things that I completely missed that should be there. Product backlog and definition of done, and the story points, and just I was coming from complete zero in knowing anything about the any kind of agile framework. So that contrast convinced me. I think it was also just another. It was the right time in my in personal development as well. I happened to take some courses at Stanford on concept of design thinking, a workshop of maybe 3 or 4 days just before, and some other things, and I started seeing how all of those things fit together in much more wholesome, enjoyable experience than what waterfall provides, what command and control provides. When engineers are told what by when, instead of estimating what by when, by nature of how they do work, and looking at data of how work is done. So all of that spoke to me.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you both. In just the next question, what were the main benefits that you saw coming through once that you've gone through the pain of getting these teams working in this way?
Mitya, that's definitely you.
This is if you hear the background, sorry. So, I'll start actually with the difficulties. In a team of 20 some people, not everybody was jumping up and down happily that their boss is now on this newly found, vector, and applying them to this as well. Yeah, that's the screaming you hear in the background. She's a little bit
That's
bigger
the younger
now and
version of
has
the screaming.
Yeah, she's
Nice.
got louder voice. Yeah. So there were those who, who did not want to adapt the new practices, the new routines, and smaller teams, and a lot of things so that was challenging, and some of those challenges actually never got resolved. But on what I saw, the benefits, there were lots of people who, I would say majority of people, it didn't start with the majority of people, but eventually majority of people, I saw they kind of, they opened up, people who were, not like leaders by title or by function, you split, when you split people into smaller teams, you have a need for a lot more leaders in that team. And a lot of people stepped up, volunteered, and were running those teams, and some of them turned out to be very capable in smoothing over conflicts in those teams. So there's so these are all kind of a little bit fuzzy, a little bit, as my daughter says, squeezy concepts. But the quality of code improved. The shippable state of the product was a huge benefit. I think that was probably one of the biggest benefits. We could always, it was difficult to communicate, as James mentioned, with a waterfall side of the business, because we couldn't give them the entire code ready to be tested, ready to be filed bugs against. But we could always give them the code where we are, MVP and MVP plus, and it would work. It was tested, and it was incremented, and it was tested, and it will always be in shippable state, or maybe almost always in the shippable state. So that was a huge benefit. A lot of stale, siloed architecture was shaken out of the code. People rewrote code that they couldn't understand, and sometimes in the process upset other people who wrote the code they couldn't understand. But code reviews, I wasn't the boss who demanded code reviews. People wanted code reviews. People demanded that I demand of others who contribute to our code base that they do the same code reviews that we do. How come they're not? How come they're breaking our code? The waterfall side of the house was not our team. So yeah, there's a lot more. I can probably go on for a long time. There were a lot more benefits, but those are the main ones.
I'm looking.
Thanks. Thank you,
What's
Mitya.
the point? This right here. These guys were pissed when these purple guys finally got onto the new BIOS code and started breaking stuff. It just goes back to what Mitya was saying. So as soon as they started touching the code, and these guys have been doing this vastly better standard, it wasn't as good as I would hope for. We weren't doing unit level testing at an automated level the way I would have hoped. But we were doing higher levels of automated testing. Yeah, as soon as that slid over, friction started. Good friction, actually, because we could have driven it to a point, and yeah, no crisis go wasted.
Awesome. I'm just moving on to the next question there that came through. A challenge in large agile adoption seemed to be how to satisfy the wider organizational requirement for progress reporting. Was this a problem for you?
Mitya, you want to go first on that one?
Progress reporting, meaning to like a larger organization?
Yeah.
Did you have project management, for example, pounding on your head?
Oh yeah. Sorry, yeah. Oh, I see. Challenges. Yeah. Wide organization requirement for yes. Oh, this is a great question. I mean, 100%. You know, this was a big problem. That was, you know, problem of having some part of the bigger organization be like us, agile, and some part of bigger organization be waterfall. You know, it was a problem. Yeah. You know, it was constant management of managing people, managing expectations, that you don't get the whole thing, but you get increments, and the cycle is not, you know, 3 months or 6 months of code development and 6 months of or 3 months of testing and filing bugs, and then, you know, another cycle of bug fixes and regression, and again another more bugs, and the metrics wasn't how many bugs we filed. You know, the more bugs, if we reach a certain threshold of filing bugs, that means we have a good quality code. All of that was a challenge for sure. Yeah. You know, maybe the follow-up question I would ask is, how, you know, how do we deal with it? And you know, most of the time it was again, it was a lot of contact with the waterfall side. You know, a lot of contact, a lot of setting expectations, a lot of explaining the same things over and over. Yeah, and you know, to be fair, you know, if you look from the other side, from the waterfall side, they know, you know, they knew that the method worked, right? It worked in the past. However, ineffective, you know, inefficiently, it worked. They didn't know that this would work, and so, you know, people were nervous. You know, we're dealing with, you know, this BIOS component. Intel ships the CPU. We must have the motherboard to go with it. We must be there on stage with Intel saying we have a system with that CPU. And here we have, you know, without BIOS, there's no product. This component decided suddenly to go agile. So it was quite quite a lot of.
Can you punch
contact.
that? Like, how big a deal is it to miss the window?
It's a. I mean, it's you know, it's hard to describe. I mean, it's you know, like visible Fortune 500 you know, miss in revenue. I mean, it's, you know,
Like millions a day or something crazy, right? I mean,
yeah.
Wow.
for every day you're not there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
You
Right.
can't
I mean,
miss it.
That's right. I mean, so yeah. I mean, so imagine there is a big so Intel puts a lot of you know, Intel Inside. I don't know if they still have Intel Inside ads, but you know, Intel puts a lot of marketing dollars into every CPU they release, every generation, and you can imagine how much leverage you get from that marketing campaign if along with that they say, well, this OEM, and this is the list of tier 1 OEMs that that offer the system, or tier 1, 2 OEMs that offer the systems with the CPU. And imagine you miss that. Now you have to catch up to your competitor OEMs, but without the marketing campaign that just finished and you weren't there. Yeah, it's major disaster for sure.
Awesome. Just going through the next question there. Thanks, Mattia and James. Did you see benefits around reduced technical debt?
Yes. Yeah. Very simply, yes. You know, longer answer. We've seen, as James mentioned, you know, people insisted that what they do, they don't have to redo over and over again. So one of the biggest technical debt in our, this is our specific maybe implementation, our specific problem was that you know, we didn't write we don't, you know, people don't write their own BIOS code. They take the BIOS code from a BIOS vendor, and integrate their own changes, customize it. In the way we implemented customizations was not portable from one to another. So it was always a big rewrite of everything. Bringing in changes from the old code base to the new code base was a major sync. And you can imagine, there's no satisfaction in doing that. Engineers are not writing any new code; they're just working, weeks and maybe longer to bring in the code, to test, to work around, different code structure and so on. So, extracting that out into an architectural way, pluggable layer, as James mentions here, I think that was a biggest technical debt that we paid up in this cycle.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question there is, how many teams did you end up with eventually?
I think was it 7, James?
I think we ended up with like 5 or 6. You and I both can't remember.
Okay. Yeah.
We started with like 3, moved to like 4 or 5 pretty quick. I don't think we ever got like much beyond 5 or 6. We would have.
Maybe 6. Yeah, it was probably 5 or 6. Okay. Yeah.
I think my case study says like 5. I'm not sure.
Right, that would make sense. Maybe 4 people in most teams and 5 people in a few teams.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are the questions on the Slido. So I'll probably just open it up to anyone still on the call. If there are any questions you would like to throw at the team before we let them go.
I guess it's an obvious one, Louis, which is what would you do differently?
Nice. Thank you, Dave.
I would try harder to get, I guess to Ronan's question, I would try harder to get more executive buy-in and, more proper feature teams from the beginning. But again, I don't know. It's not like I know for certain that would have worked. It might have backfired. Nitya, anything you'd do differently?
Yeah. What I would do different? Well, I wouldn't have the layoffs, and but and that really put a dent in our, in many ways in what we were doing. It shrunk the team significantly, and we had to reassess.
Lulu, be quiet. It's okay.
So that that was one thing for sure. I think I think getting the team in India on board, I would do that maybe more aggressively, which was I'm not sure if we were successful, but this is what I wish would happen differently. I wish the entire team there would be on board and not part of it. Meaning the team in India wasn't really it isn't really team under my control, but it was team that was also doing BIOS code. It would be very nice if all of us were in the same framework. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Any sort of last questions? Okay, so yeah, I think we'll probably wrap at this point, but we're going to be lingering for a little while. So those that are interested, I'd like to talk a bit more with the team about training opportunities. So those of you that are interested in attending training, please stick around. We're just going to be chatting about that for a bit. But the rest of you, that's probably the session and where we got to. So yeah, just want to thank the two of you so much for coming and talking to us and sharing your experiences. Every bit we do makes a big difference to us in understanding a bit more of what's going out there that we can perhaps apply. So thank you, Mattia and James. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a privilege. So glad to have you here, and love to meet you in person one day. Let's hope. So
Absolutely. So yeah, let's stick around. I'm gonna hover, and James, we can talk about training and maybe opportunities in New Zealand. So those of you that are interested in sticking around for that, please do. And the rest of you, have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to share the experience with everybody.
Thank you so much, Mattia. Appreciate it.
So here we go. So as the newest LeSS trainer, I have the first class ever that I'm going to run that is listed in Austin. And David is on the call here. He's involved in helping get this going. And, you know, this has a cool video if you want to help sell it. But what's also interesting as it comes to New Zealand, I have been running this survey here. If I can find enough people, and I just sent out that link on the chat. If I can find enough people, I can run a course. I've even looked at, you know, space in space there. You don't have a lot of rooms. You don't have a lot of different venues that have enough space for the heavy system modeling involved. The Intercontinental does. You know, flights are terribly expensive, so we have to have enough people to make it worthwhile. But that's what that survey is about. So if we find enough people, we can probably run it. In the States, critical mass is about a dozen at a hotel venue. It's about half that if we have free space. Here to be a little more than that, I suspect, to hit break even, because the flights are more, and you know, I'm certainly going to have to fly in several days in advance to get over the jet lag. But very serious about, you know, find me people. We'll run a course.
And James, just to be clear, what is CLP? That's the CLP, right? Certified LeSS Practitioner course. What does that give you? Certified LeSS.
Yes. So
what does that cover off?
So
just broadly, I know it's a massive course, but
these range from a how to a why, or from a why to a how. So a very why-leaning certified LeSS practitioner, which is almost the same as a certified LeSS for executives, is very much focused on how various organizational design elements influence adaptability, and therefore how that influences value delivery. And so in the course that I've built, which is very similar to Craig's in many ways, we spend a lot of time at each table mapping the relationships and mapping the influence how one variable influences another variable, and how, you know, having more than one product backlog, for example, how does that influence the awareness of the teams as a whole of the overall context, and then how does that influence adaptability, and how does focusing on technical debt influence the amount of technical debt, and how does that influence adaptability, and how does, you know, that overall awareness of everything influence the amount of focus that's on technical debt. And so how do all of these things interrelate to each other? And a lot of time is spent doing that. And if your ultimate system optimization goal is if you're looking for a global level adaptiveness and value delivery, you will end up with an organizational structure that looks very similar to LeSS, because LeSS has the same design goal. But it's not a course about LeSS, it's a course about how it's really organizational design in disguise. And then there's enough LeSS there, because I find that without some binding to the concrete, how do you take action on it, it's hard to maintain retention
Mm,
unless you've already kind of done that background reading, which some people have, and then you're probably better off staying more abstract because they're able to make those connections. So that's a very Y-leaning version of the CLP, which is what mine currently is. Very similar to Craig's in many ways. I'm using the same models he is using. The other end of the spectrum is very much an applied how to actually do multi-team refinement, how to do initial product backlog refinement, how to run multi-team sprint reviews, how to come up with your initial definition of done. How do you draft that? So very, very applied. They're really almost two separate courses, and they're really like part A and part B. It's not that one is better than the other. They're different.
So I'm kind of thinking, if I'm like in our case where we had a quite a large sort of a large program, doing agile, trying to be adaptive as best I can. So would this training give you a bit more of another way of looking at that scaling, perhaps?
It would.
Yeah. Okay.
And so if you get structure right, if you get the executive buy-in that you need in order to make the changes that you need organizationally, you'll be successful.
Yeah.
And the details, you can go read the details. It's not that big a deal. That's, to be honest, that's not quite true. Don't get me wrong. There's tremendous value in the how. And it's not entirely obvious how you do the how, no matter how much reading you do. So that's not to take away from that. But if you don't have the why such that you can get people on board the way that I failed to at that C level, or that, I didn't have enough, I didn't get all of my VPs aligned in this case study we just talked about. I got a few of them aligned, right? I didn't get them bought in at the level that Mitri was bought in. Had I done that, it would have been more helpful. We might have been far more successful. And the way that the course is run, I'm not actually telling people the answers. They're coming to these answers themselves, and they're learning the tools and skills they need to do that themselves. Does that help?
Yeah, that totally, that helps. So guys,
I need names. That's the gas that makes this go, guys. I gotta have enough people. And then if I get enough people, what I'll do is I'll line up a venue, and maybe I'll have someone help me line up a venue. We can coordinate, and you can go check it out in person to make sure that the walls will have wizard wall that sticks and this kind of thing. So just do a little scouting for me. Yep. And then I'll get them to give me a proposed contract, and I can do this pre-registration thing where everybody puts their card on file. And then as soon as we get enough people, and we'll kind of do this all at the same time before we lose the salesperson at the hotel who says, yes, I have availability, right? So we need, a pretty tight window. I'll process the cards, lock in the hotel, and boom, book myself an airplane ticket. Awesome. But we just have to culminate to we have a list, we have a committed list of people, they want to go, their cards are on file, and I have a hotel that's got the right date. We check it with everybody, make sure the dates are good. We good. Everybody says yes, okay, boom, 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 lock it in, and I go, right? So okay. That's what I'm trying to do. Awesome. The alternative is some big bank, some Fortune 500 or whatever, they say, you know what, we'll buy, let's say it's 15 tickets, right? We don't know who's going to be in those 15 seats, but we promise you that we'll buy 15 seats. And I'll say, oh, okay. That's enough that hopefully, even if I don't make money on it, I'll break even, and hopefully we'll fill up the class with other people, and I'll make some profit on them. But at least I know I'll break even because somebody bought a big ticket block. And if they actually have space for us, and say they're a neutral, say they're not in the consulting business or whatever, they're just an industrial manufacturer or a tech company of some sort, right? Then that cuts our break even in half, because you don't have to pay the hotel all that money. and you don't have to have locked in food at the same amount. So those are the financial realities of letting me go, of me being able to come help you.
Perfect.
And I would love to do it, but I've got to be able to it's got to be viable for me to be able to do it and not end up with, you know, $15,000 in debt because no one showed up.
Of course. James, leave that with me for the moment. I'll scout around and see who else is interested. And if any of the people that are left in the call are interested, maybe you can get in touch with me as well. I'm local, so it may be easier, or James, however you want to play it. But yeah, let's have another chat about that, James, and see if we can rally enough people to make that possible. Because we've never, to my knowledge, had a certified LeSS training happening in New Zealand. So it'll be great to have to be the first.
Thank you. Yeah. Let Lewis know. I have a feeling it'll be Lewis that goes and tests the walls for us. But
yeah. No, I'm really keen. I'm really keen to put something together and get people together.
Y'all saw the chat. Y'all saw this thing, and it's also on my. If you check my LinkedIn profile, I've made multiple posts with this silly survey. Not a lot of people are answering yet.
Yep.
But we just need quorum, and we'll run it.
Perfect.
So.
Thank you so much, James. I'm going to have to drop off for another call as well. So thanks again for all your effort and time in doing this for us.
Very welcome. Y'all have a wonderful night or morning.
Morning,
I guess.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Have a good
Cheers.
day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.